Hi, folks. David Graff from Oler Graff talking about how to talk to people about money. Interesting conversations. We seem to be having them. Budget season is coming up, but it's always a relevant topic. And the purpose of today's discussion is to talk about certain things that I think are important to consider when we're talking to people about money, and things that, where you can learn from my mistakes that I continue to make and have made recently. And then we'll talk about some of the common money mindsets that I see that homeowners bring to a meeting, and try to pick those apart so that we're pitching to the largest group in the room, to the reasonable people in the room, and trying to figure out who do we double down on with knowledge and support, and who do we respectfully listen to and then maybe kind of hope to not continue to engage with because that person may be difficult, angry, or who knows what. So that's today's conversation. Obviously, when we're talking about money, usually we're talking about not having enough money. Usually the conversations that we have where a community may have too much money are easily handled, right? That's easy. Do we refund money? Do we have a negative operating budget for the next couple of years to draw down the reserves that may have gone over? Do we just leave it as is? What do we do? Not usually so contentious. It still can be contentious in terms of the refund demands that owners will make. But usually the conversation is about not having enough money. And the reality is, like everything in life, usually when we defer pain, it gets worse. Infrastructure maintenance, when we defer that, it gets worse. Lack of financial, lack of revenue, keep kicking that can down the road, it gets worse. It's not necessarily a surprise that those issues don't improve with time, but it's sometimes surprising that owners will be as upset as they are when there is that reckoning. And by that, I mean, if there's a lower assessment artificially, and I'll talk about this later, it hides the true cost of ownership within that community. And when that happens, there's almost always a reckoning. And that reckoning is, we need to do something that costs money that we don't have, and therefore we need to raise money. Not the most fun conversation. And for some of our clients, they just don't know what they don't know. And it's, of course, there's no one on this call, or no one that's professionally managed, typically, because reserve studies are ubiquitous in our communities. Just about every community that we have under representation that has any meaningful infrastructure to maintain, repair, or replace has a reserve study. And the law doesn't require necessarily a specific reserve study. It doesn't have to be done professionally. It can be done in-house, but we find generally that the ones that are done by the experts are a little bit better. And they're a little bit easier to use to sell an assessment increase to the owners, because it was produced by someone who doesn't have any financial or emotional ties to the community. And when we don't know what it is that we have to maintain, repair, and replace, or if we do know, we don't know how long it's going to last in its current state, then we have ambiguity. And when we have ambiguity in our maintenance obligations, we can't help but have wild guesses in our reserve funding levels. And that's a problem, right? And sometimes we have issues, and we have a few communities where their governing documents still contain assessment limitations that are very burdensome for the association to live with in terms of raising the revenue necessary to run the company. And of course, we have owner apathy. And if documents were written in the 70s, and for example, they say that an owner vote, a majority of a quorum is required to increase the assessment over the prior year by more than, say, 5%, we find our clients having a lot of difficulty in getting that majority of a quorum vote. Not only is it difficult to get a majority of a quorum vote, in the best of times, when you're doing it only to increase the assessments that the owners pay, it can be downright impossible. So obviously we want to get rid of those provisions, amend them out of the declaration if we can. And sometimes that requires extraordinary effort for a limited window of time to get those out because they're really troublesome. The other thing that I think is interesting right now is that it seems to me for the last 16 years, which is when SB 100 took effect, we've created a climate where owners are feeling very free to attack their association and talk about exercising their rights. And my personal opinion, rights can't be exercised without responsibilities, right? Responsibilities are the deposit in that bank account that then later allows us to withdraw those rights that we may need to exercise later. It's interesting to me because most of the conversations that I have with owners in meetings involves them having rights. And I get it, they have rights. There's no question about it. But they also have responsibilities. And I don't think it's fashionable or desirable right now for most of our population to consider the fact that rights are almost always coupled with responsibilities. And then we get the owners who are just freaking out, right? And I have a complete other class on that about meeting martial arts and handling difficult people and all of that stuff. I won't go into it in too great a detail. But it's sad that Surfside, I think, represents this, aside from being a horrific tragedy, it represents this idea that if we ignore these problems long enough, something very bad will happen. And it's really sad that it happened in this manner. But there's a consequence. There's a cost to deferring maintenance and to deferring reserve funding that is inescapable. And until this tragedy, it's been really hard to prove to the community members that we deal with, what can happen. And I'm not suggesting you go out and beat the Surfside drum to say we need more money because of this, but it's a manifestation or an icon of what can happen when deferred maintenance and possibly reserve funding inattention. I'm not blaming them for not having money, but they obviously didn't spend the money when they needed to, continues on for a period of time. So again, I wouldn't use it in every case because then people will say you're fear mongering. But again, it's just a manifestation of what can happen in an extreme scenario when the things that we're talking about, funding and replacement of items, does not happen. So this gets a little bit into the meeting martial arts class, and I don't want to go down that route altogether, but it's worth, I think, repeating that board members, volunteer leaders, management team members, they live in the world, meaning you live in a world of fact. How much money do we have? How much money do we estimate we'll need? What does the reserve study say? What is the current budget? What are our 5 years of actuals? Those are all facts. What is the state of our infrastructure? Are the balconies decaying? Is there structural concerns? Do we need a new roof? Facts. Now they can be, subject to disagreement, as any fact can be. Oh, I don't think it's that bad, but those are still facts. And when you deal in the fact world, especially as a volunteer leader on behalf of an association, it seems imposing or insulting for owners to come in who haven't educated themselves, don't know what's going on, and they critique you, berate you, criticize you for not being transparent enough. And the board's thinking, geez, how could we be more transparent? We're meeting in open meetings every month that are announced. And again, that's a different problem, but the point I'm trying to make is that these owners will come in with a lot of emotion, right? There's facts in there, but they don't have the same facts that you do. And yes, that's their fault probably for not having those facts because they haven't taken the time to educate themselves, but it doesn't change the fact that they come into your meeting, their meeting, and are very emotional. And it's difficult in my experience to have a very logical conversation with someone who is very emotional. Someone comes in, I can't believe this. I don't have the money. How dare you? How did this happen? Why am I surprised? And when you start talking numbers immediately, it just usually doesn't land well. So one of the things that we try to do is sort out those facts and emotion. Let me see. I have a slide slightly out of order. The talk is to acknowledge the stress and maybe the surprise, right? This is what we call in the coaching world acknowledging and validating. We're going to acknowledge that Thank you for being here. I understand that you're surprised, and I understand that you're scared about having to pay a larger assessment. And you're also scared that there may be deferred maintenance that you weren't aware of. And I can completely appreciate the fact that you feel surprised by this, right? Because you haven't been involved in the association's affairs, not blaming you for not involving yourself. But that's just a fact which leads to this surprise. Get it. And if I was in your shoes, I would be frustrated. I would be angry. I would be scared as well. Let's get that out of the way. And once we've done that, when we've offloaded that emotion, we've had hopefully some meaningful ability to convey to the owner that they've been heard, that we know where they're coming from, and we don't have to say they're right. This is not validating the fact that they're upset. It's just validating that they are upset. And in a very sarcastic way, you could say only to yourself, if I had as little information as you did about the running of the association, I would be frustrated and scared as well, right? It's a fact that they're frustrated. It's not necessarily justification for being frustrated. And then we can get into the talk. Now, the talk is going to depend on what we have to do. And it's either a board meeting or an owner's meeting. And it's a regular board meeting or a special board meeting, and a regular annual owner's meeting or a special owner's meeting. And every meeting should have an objective. And even if that objective is education or calming or discussing something that will someday or soon go to an owner vote, or if it's to elect directors, great. If we have to ask the owners for a vote at that meeting, like it's a budget ratification meeting, or where we need an affirmative yes vote from a certain number of owners, it changes the way we operate a little bit, or it should, depending on the circumstance. And by that, I mean to say that if an owner comes in, and we'll talk about these common mindsets next, they come in and they don't have any information. If we're not asking for their vote that night, we have this absolute freedom to not have to educate them on the spot in front of the owners. We have the fourth dimension of time, which we can add into this conversation, which is homeowner comes in and they're upset about the budget, proposed budget, and they want to know everything there is to know about the association's finances. Well, if we're not asking for their vote that night, we can say, you know what? We don't have the time to deal with all of these questions tonight and tell you everything that we've spent or raised in revenue over the past 20 years, but I can give you my email address, if it's a manager, hopefully, and say, I'll give you the last X number of years of financial statements, the reserve study, our proposed budget. You can take all the time you want. Then when we come back next month and have this conversation, you'll be in a much better place to understand where your money goes. But I don't, or we don't think it's fair to take everyone's time to answer that question, because there are people here who know where their money goes generally, and they may have a much more specific question that we're capable of answering tonight. If you have to go to the vote, then it's a little bit different conversation, because you can't send them off away from the meeting to review the financials and then come back. So I'll talk about that. So just be aware that if we're asking for their vote, it's likely going to change how we respond to people who need to get up to speed very quickly before they will cast their vote. Whereas if we're not asking for their vote, we can provide them with all the tools, documentation, information that they want, and they can take the time and the effort to educate themselves offline. One of the other things that happens when people like managers and volunteer leaders, board members, live in the world of facts is that they assume that other people also live in the world of facts, and that's just not the case. And so that's not a critique, that's just my reality, which is, you deal in logical issues. You're advancing the corporation's agenda year by year by year by year. Those are facts. And it's important to recognize that owners probably couldn't care less about the association unless or until it affects them. And it may affect them by writing an assessment check or a larger check, or it may affect them by having a covenant violation letter or what have you. And it's super helpful just to recognize, not knowing any of the people perhaps in the meeting room, that most of the people in the room don't share the same information that we have. And I'm going to reserve judgment as to why I shouldn't blame them for not having the facts. It's not helpful to blame them. If they don't have the facts, it's difficult to have a productive conversation. Now, we don't have to assume people are idiots, right? And that's also a pitfall on the extreme other end that usually backfires spectacularly. But you might have a conversation saying, we all have different levels of information. We've all lived here for different lengths of time. Some of us have been on the board before, some of us have not. We don't all, we're not on an equal baseline. And because of that, the board may choose to, and I'll talk about this next, establish a minimum understanding of the information. Sorry, here we go. And one way you might do that, and I'm going to use a budget meeting because we're talking about money, right? To say, and it's going to depend. If we're asking for their vote that night, we really kind of have to establish this minimum baseline of understanding because that's going to influence the vote. So you might say, I have 2 years of actual financials and I have the proposed budget handy. I also have a comparison to show or a spreadsheet to show the notable differences in the proposed budget from prior year's actuals. We also have a copy of the reserve study. And in some cases, you might have experts in the room to make this pitch, especially if we're talking about an assessment increase that's made necessary by a large infrastructure project. And you all know the experts that you might choose. And I just wanted a couple lists because some of them we don't think about. Reserve specialists will often come to board meetings or owner meetings and explain what their reserve study says, how they came up with it, and justify their recommendation for a funding increase. Super helpful. Parliamentarian, usually for process issues, lawyer, CPA, contractor, engineer, architect, any of them, depending on the purpose of the meeting, could add tremendous value because it's somebody from outside the community supporting the board's request, right? And anytime we make an ask of the owners, we want to have some confidence that we can justify the ask. And so if you need an expert, by all means, ask them to come and to support that conversation because in my experience, usually it's worth a multiple of what you might pay them, depending on what issue you're facing. So now we're in the meeting, and there are a few mindsets that I see that come up. And there's one common expression that sometimes masks three separate mindsets. And I'm not talking about them in chronological order here so that hopefully it's a little bit more clear. But the expression that the owner makes, let me step back. There's very rarely this person, but sometimes there is. This is the let's do it right person. This is the person who is concerned about the level of reserve funding or lack of reserve funding and wants the board to more aggressively fund reserves so that maintenance items can be more proactively addressed or the community can be beautified or what have you. That's pretty rare. We do see those people, and when they say, let's do it right, this is where I've invested my money, I live here, it's usually very, very compelling. Some people will, roll their eyes, especially if it's a former board member, but when someone says, we just have to do this, it can be very persuasive. Now, the one expression that we get that masks three similar mindsets is the concept, it's a resistance to an increase in assessments. And it usually goes something like, I can invest my money better than you can. Sometimes it's, how dare you propose raising my assessments? You don't need to raise my assessments, or I oppose anything the association does. And so what I'm going to talk about now is how you take that thing that the owner says, where they say, I can invest my money better than you can, or I don't want to pay more money, and try to diagnose what mindset they actually have, because sometimes it's hard to figure this out. Now, let's say that this person truly is in this mindset that they can invest their money better than you can, and maybe that's a CPA or a financial planner or something like that. And they actually can invest. That's the irony here, is that they can invest their money better than you can, because the association is not free to invest in risky investments. It's designed not to lose principal in its investments. And most people of any investment sophistication can absolutely do a better job than the association can. And so the question then becomes, well, how do we, either a volunteer leader or a management team member, how do we take that objection and turn it into a yes? Yes, I'll support the assessment increase. And in this case, let's talk about this person being a CPA. Clearly, they have the money. And you might say, okay, you know what? You're right. You can invest your money better than we can because we're not free to invest in risky investments. We have to preserve principal. We do so through very conservative investments because we don't feel the luxury of being able to risk the principal balance for investment, in the market. But and we know that you can invest your money better than we can, and we can appreciate that fact, and we're glad that you brought that up. What you might think about, though, is that all of your neighbors may not be, or some of your neighbors may not be as savvy as you are with respect to investments. And we know that when we knock on your door and ask for a special assessment because we've deferred this assessment increase that we're contemplating tonight to another year or two, we know that when we ask you for the money, you'll have it. Okay, that's a given. How comfortable are you that your neighbors have that check to write 2 years from now? Because you're tied at the hip financially to them. And the longer we defer the assessment increase, the larger that reckoning day will be, meaning the larger the assessment increase will be later. Because just because we're not increasing the assessments does not mean that our expenses are not increasing outside of our control. And the larger that assessment gets, the harder it is for us to get voluntarily. It costs us money to collect money. It's better to have it than be asking for it. And how thoroughly do you trust your neighbors to be as financially savvy as you are? And if the answer is I fully trust them, well, then the owners cannot approve the increase. And we will all expect you to pay a pretty stinking large check when we need it 2 years from now. Most people will come to their senses and look at some, they may know some of the data that the reality is their neighbors don't have any money. And there's a good percentage of their neighbors that will not have $5,000, $1,000 to pay for a special assessment. And they realize, and you can say it in a gentle way, you'll be subsidizing defaults because there's no other source of funding. So if 10% or 20% of our owners default, we don't know that they will, but we can assume that some will, that shortfall is made up by people like you. If we have the money in the bank, there is nothing to default on. But if we have to ask for a large special assessment, you can count on there being defaults, and you can count on you and your other excellent, upstanding neighbors to make up for that deficiency. My experience, that's been very effective at getting their support. Now, that person often sounds exactly like the wolf in sheep's clothing. And they may say something like, I can invest my money better than you can, or don't you dare raise my assessments. This mindset is different than the CPA. This is someone who doesn't have any money, and they're not going to come out and say they don't have any money. And instead, they will say something like the CPA said. And so if we have reason to believe that they don't have the money, we might be able to make a more effective pitch. Now, you could use the same pitch for the CPA on this one, but sometimes it's important to think about it in a different way, which is, listen, you bought this unit, you live here, right? You can sell it and you'll no longer owe assessments, but until you do that, you owe assessments. And we, the association, owe you the duty of maintenance described in the declaration. And we're not going to fail to maintain the infrastructure that we're obligated to maintain in a reasonable manner. We can't, as a matter of law and as a matter of contract and as a matter of fairness, we just can't do that. And so we're going to get the money. And as long as you're an owner here, we're going to get the money from you. Now, the longer we continue to defer this pain, the more acute the pain will be when we have that day of reckoning. So, and sometimes we have this conversation in extreme circumstances where we say, listen, if the board can't get the owner approval, if it's necessary, to increase the budget, or if homeowners threaten to throw off the board if they increase the assessment, then one of the board members or more of them, or the majority, may ask us to petition the court for a receiver to be appointed to take possession of the property and to have extraordinary powers authorized by the court to raise assessments to replenish the association's bank account. And what that really means to you is A, a lot of legal fees, B, a manager known to the court as a receiver getting paid a significant hourly rate far beyond that of what your current manager gets paid. C, you've lost local control of your community because a third party is in charge of your association. And D, has been appointed by the court to have all kinds of authority to raise assessments without concern for you. So if you want to give up local control of your community, meaning keeping it run by neighbors, being run by a professional manager at a reasonable rate, and not have to pay legal fees, then you might support this assessment increase. And if you don't, because you feel that you can't, well, then we may have to consider that receivership if it's true, right? We never threaten things that aren't accurate, but we may have to consider that because the association has some pretty critical infrastructure upgrades that it needs to make. That seems to work reasonably well. And then there's this condo death spiral, and that's what we call it here in our office. And some people have a negative reaction to when I say this, so I don't mean to offend anybody, but it's played out many times in my career here that when an association has deferred assessment increases, what they've really done as a practical matter is that they've hidden the true cost of ownership of a unit within that community. And when they hide that true cost of ownership, because the assessments are, my words, artificially low, they will have people who buy into that community based on, say, $20 a month less in assessments, meaning people will squeeze themselves into whatever homes they can buy. And if this association is $20 a month cheaper in assessments than the one across the street, there's going to be a certain number of people who base their buying decision on a home on that small, relatively small amount of money. And as long as the true cost of ownership of a unit in that community is deflated, suppressed, hidden, whatever term you want to use, we will have poorer and poorer people moving into the community. And that reckoning that we will have with the amount of assessments being levied and the true needs of the association gets larger and larger and larger. And the death spiral kind of implodes upon itself when the dig out of that problem that has, been created over many years, in some cases decades, is so large that the people who live there don't have the financial strength to write the check. And that's when we have receivership, walkaways, bankruptcies, and everything else. And so this is not a condemnation of people who don't have money, but when we do hide the true cost of ownership, we have to know that there's going to be a reckoning. And when people buy in with the sweetness of low price, they're going to unfortunately have the bitterness of that reckoning probably reasonably quickly. And the question for us is, do they have the ability to dig out of it? And in some cases, the answer is no. And that's a huge problem for everyone who lives there because now we can't keep the lights on. So that's what we call the condo death spiral. I believe in it as fact, as economic law. Take it for what you think it is worth. But anytime we hide the true cost of ownership, we're going to have a reckoning. And can the people handle that reckoning? So one of the mindsets we get is bewilderment, where someone says, and this irritates me to no end, and I try not to show it, but someone will say, where does our money go? And they might even have their phone out with their calculator and say, I've lived here for 12 years, $200 a month times 12 months times 12 years times 200 homeowners means that we should have $385 million in our reserve account. Where is it? You're like, oh my gosh. Do I have the ability to start from scratch with this person in front of all these other people? It's kind of the epitome of having no recognition of what the association does, and clearly having taken no time to look at the association's financials. So how do you deal with that mindset? Well, here's my suggestion. If you have the luxury of time, meaning you're not asking for an owner vote at that meeting, you might say, you know what, we can't answer that easily tonight, but what we can do is give you all of the data documentation that will answer all of these questions for you. Send me an email in the morning. I'll email you the last X number of years of actual financials, the proposed budget, the reserve study, and you can see where your money goes. Easy enough. If you're asking for their vote, it's hard to say, I'm not going to tell you, because I think that brings discredit to the board and the management team for not having some answer. And so if I'm going to go to a contentious board meeting, what I would hope, or a budget meeting, I would hope the board or the management team would have is rough numbers. You might say, you know what, we can't get into every line item in the budget. We just don't have the time. We mailed it out 20 days ago and you had plenty of time to look at it. But I can tell you that it's roughly 10% for water. It's 20% for insurance. It's 5% for management. It's X% for reserve study. Generally, that's where your money goes. It's a nonprofit corporation. It doesn't mean we can't make money, but we base our budget on clearing our expenses and adding to our reserve account. Here's 2 years of actual financials you can look at. Here's the proposed budget. You can see the difference. If you do it that way, you may be able to foreclose or box them into not asking questions, because when they're upset and they don't know where their money goes, they're going to seize upon a line item invariably, and they're going to say, $80,000 for insurance. I'm an insurance agent. I could do this for $20,000. And if you get into that debate, you're going to plant in the minds of other owners, geez, is she right? Could you actually do it for 20,000 instead of 80,000? And it's just very difficult to not turn it into a debacle when you're debating line items with someone who has no idea about the budget. So for me, it would be a general answer. If we had the ability to allow them to take time for themselves to look at the financials out of the meeting, that would be best case. But if we have to ask for that vote tonight, we're really not pitching to this person, because they'll probably vote no matter what. But we're trying to instill confidence in the other owners who are voting to say, we generally know where the money goes, and you can recite that by percentage, rough numbers off the cuff. That's just a very easy credibility boosting conversation. Another mindset we get is expressed as, my sister lives in another condominium across town and their assessments are $200. Why are ours $350 a month? Worst mistake you can make, I think, as a board or a management team member, is to say, well, they don't have a pool, do they? Because we have a pool in a clubhouse. And you know what? You're bound by the truth and they're not. And invariably, the other person's going to say, well, oh, absolutely, they have a pool in a clubhouse. Oh, and they have racquetball courts too. And then you're going to have the rational people in the room going, geez, well, why are our assessments $350 instead of $200, like she says they should be? We've given that argument credit when there's a much more effective way to handle it, I think, which is, you know what? I don't know where your sister lives. I don't know if it's a condo. I don't know if it's a planned community. For all I know, it might be an apartment. You don't have to say that. I don't know if they've had insurance claims. I don't know if they believe in reserve funding. I don't know how old it is. I don't know what amenities they have. And for purposes of tonight, it doesn't necessarily matter, because we have 2 years of actual financials here with us, and we have a proposed budget and a sheet showing the highlighted differences between those. So if your sister would like to provide us with how she lives in a community with $200 a month assessments and all of the amenities that we have and everything else, we'd be glad to look at it. But we can't vote on your sister's community. We can only vote on our budget. And our budget is reasonably close to our historical average of expenses, but for these notable variances. Because again, you go down that road and they're going to say something, and you're going to have the rational people in the room saying, geez, I think we're paying too much. You don't want to do that, right? You cannot debate a fictitious community that may not even exist. It may not be $200 a month. Who knows what it is? Don't take the bait, would be my advice. And then the last mindset that sounds like I can invest my money better than you sometimes manifests as someone who will say, or someone who believe, it doesn't matter what you think you need. It doesn't even matter what you actually need as a board. I don't trust the association because fill in the blank, and therefore I will vote no on anything. And I have somebody that I talk to about every year who every time we have a conversation about how bad the association is being run, he brings up something that happened to him in the 90s. Okay. The people that he's angry with have moved out of that community more than 20 years ago. And we're still dealing with this. I am on an annual basis. And the idea is that if you can flesh out someone who says, I just don't trust the board with my money, then the response can be, okay, fair enough. I understand that we can't build trust in a meeting. We hope to earn your trust over the course of many years. To earn that trust, we would ask that you come to board meetings and participate. And since nothing that we can say tonight will make any difference to you, we're going to move on, right? This person will vote no on principle. All the documents, the data, the explanations in the world don't make any difference. Don't waste your time. Respectfully, don't waste your time. We don't ever say, you might say, well, it sounds like you have a philosophical objection based on a lack of trust. We'd love to earn that trust. Doesn't sound like we'll be able to do it tonight. So we will, value everyone else's time and try to be responsive to their questions about specific issues in front of them as voting owners. And that's the difference between the substance and the personality. That person who's philosophically opposed to the association doesn't care about the substance. So don't focus on the substance. And, to the extent you can usher them to the exit door as quick as you can, not meaning kick them out, but keep them from occupying the time of everyone else who may have questions that we can answer, I think you're well served to do that. And we don't have to do it in a bad way because we're not trying to create enemies. We're not trying to create crusaders or mutineers who want to overthrow the board. And these days, it's very easy to do that, to upset someone, and they go door to door, and next door gets involved, and there's an embezzlement rumor and a scandal of this and scandal of that. And suddenly we have a recall meeting that costs money. It sometimes costs a board overthrow. Sometimes it causes management to get fired. And we have this huge brain drain with all of this institutional knowledge gone, right? And sometimes we wonder, geez, if I hadn't insulted that person because it felt good at the time, would we be facing this recall meeting? And again, it's not necessarily our business as lawyers to say who should be on the board, but we do believe, I certainly believe strongly, that change, loss of institutional knowledge, loss of management continuity is a huge setback in the success of a community. And we can usually sometimes avoid it, not always. And then there's always the snipers, right? There's people who are taking pot shots and muttering and laughing and rolling their eyes. You don't ever want your board to do that. And if the board does that, then we need to have a conversation about how do we project professionalism and competence and curiosity with what people bring in, as opposed to resistance, snarky behavior and other things that are off-putting. And I think that when you get these snipes in, instead of ignoring them, you might say, I understand. I appreciate the sarcasm in your comment, and I suspect that is, born of frustration or what have you. And thank you for your comment. Is there any specific question that we could answer with facts or data that you need within your 3 minutes or whatever? So the mistake I think that board members make is that they're human, and when they're attacked, human nature is to want to defend yourself. And so you say, no, that's not true. And how dare you say that? And oh my gosh, have no idea of how hard we work on your behalf. And it off-puts the people in the room who realize that, they, don't ever wrestle with a pig, right? They bring you down to their level and you get mud all over you. And it reflects poorly on the board for engaging in that conduct in kind. And so you might say, I hear what you're saying. I understand there's a frustration that's causing that. If there's any documents or information that I could provide that would help you, I'd be happy to do it. Otherwise, thanks for your comment. I'm not going to waste everyone's time defending myself because it's not about me. It's about this association in which all of us are owners. So I'm going to turn off the recording now. Take any questions that you have.